My name is Elara, and I'm 23 years old. 5 years ago, I stood in the shadow of a locker bank while my own father told my advanced economics teacher that I was a waste of her time. He stood there in his bespoke Italian suit, adjusting his Rolex, and confidently stated that I had not inherited his intellect. He was a prominent Boston real estate developer, and in his eyes, I was just a quiet, submissive hurdle standing between him and a multi-million-dollar trust fund left by my late mother. He planned to drain that account dry and legally erase my financial existence the moment I turned 18. He thought I would just sign the waiver and fade away, but he made one critical miscalculation. He delivered that insult to the wrong teacher. Before we dive into how I dismantled his entire corporate empire from the inside out, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories, but only if this narrative truly resonates with you. Also, drop your age and location in the comments below. I really want to know who is listening right now. Now let me take you back to a sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway inside my elite Massachusetts high school, exactly 3 months before my 18th birthday. Parent-teacher night was winding down. The corridor smelled of floor wax and the expensive perfumes of wealthy suburban parents. I hovered out of sight near the water fountain, waiting for my father to finish his mandated 5-minute check-in with Ms. Clara Reed. Ms. Reed was new to the faculty. She wore sharp blazers, kept her hair pulled back in a severe clasp, and possessed a gaze that made even the most entitled students sit up straight. Richard, my father, did not handle women like her well. I listened to his leather shoes shift impatiently on the linoleum. "Do not waste your time on her," Richard said, his voice echoing off the metal lockers. "She is a sweet girl, but she does not have the head for numbers. She has not inherited my mind. Just pass her with a C so we can both move on." I heard the metallic clink of his watch band. He did not wait for a response. He simply turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps fading toward the glass exit doors. I stepped out from behind the wall, my chest tight with a familiar, suffocating shame. I expected Ms. Reed to pack her briefcase and leave. Instead, she stood perfectly still, watching the doors swing shut behind him. Then, she turned her head and locked eyes with me. She did not offer a pitying smile. She just gestured for me to step inside her empty classroom. I walked in and stood by the front desk. Ms. Reed reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She handed it to me. The paper felt heavy, dense with secrets. "I have been waiting for the right moment to give you this," Ms. Reed said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I spent 15 years as a corporate auditor before I started teaching. Your father recently submitted his corporate tax returns to the school board. He wants to sponsor the new science wing to secure a tax write-off. The board saw a generous donor. I saw an anomaly." I opened the clasp and slid the papers out. They were financial schedules, heavily redacted in places, but the core numbers remained visible. "Look at line item 42, she instructed. My eyes scanned the dense grid of digits. It was a trust account. The title bore my mother's maiden name. My heart skipped a beat. I had always been told my mother died with nothing, leaving Richard to build his empire from scratch and support me out of the goodness of his heart. But the numbers told a vastly different story. The columns documented massive, systematic withdrawals. Hundreds of thousands of dollars bled from the trust each quarter, funneled into shell holding companies tied to my father's commercial developments. "His wealth is an illusion," Ms. Reed stated, leaning against the chalkboard. "He is using your inheritance to prop up failing investments. By the time you turn 18 in 3 months, that account will hold nothing but dust." I stared at the black ink on the white paper, the luxury cars, the sprawling suburban mansion, the designer clothes my stepmother flaunted. They were all purchased with my stolen future. The air in the classroom grew thin. Richard did not just view me as a disappointment. He viewed me as a ticking clock. He needed to legally bind me to this theft before I gained the rights to audit that trust myself. "Fold those up and put them in your bag," Ms. Reed said, stepping back to her desk. "You go home tonight and you act like the oblivious teenager he thinks you are. We have work to do." I slid the envelope into my backpack. The humiliation I felt in the hallway had vanished. replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. I walked out of the school and into the crisp autumn night, knowing I was returning to a house built on lies, and I needed to find the exact blueprint to tear it down. The wrought iron gates of our Wellesley estate parted with a quiet mechanical hum, allowing me to step onto the long gravel driveway. I rolled my shoulders forward, letting my posture drop into a familiar slouch. I allowed my eyes to glaze over, adopting the vacant, apathetic stare of a teenager who only cared about screen time and avoiding household chores. This deliberate physical shift was my armor. By the time I pushed open the heavy oak front door of the mansion, I was no longer the girl holding explosive forensic tax documents in her backpack. I was the ghost that haunted the edges of Richard's perfect, gilded life. The foyer smelled of fresh lilies and Sylvia's signature designer perfume. Stepping into this house always felt like entering a beautifully decorated cage. Sylvia had maneuvered her way into the role of stepmother less than a year after my own mother passed away. She arrived with a taste for European sports cars and a convenient pregnancy that eventually produced my half-brother, Chase. From the moment she unpacked her bags, my presence in the house was treated as an unfortunate administrative oversight. We sat around the sprawling marble dining table that evening. The clinking of heavy silver forks against fine porcelain underscored the toxic hierarchy ruling our family. Richard sat at the head of the table, dictating the flow of conversation like a CEO leading a hostile board meeting. Chase, 18 months younger than me but treated like the reigning crown prince, casually twirled the keys to a brand new BMW he had just received for making the varsity lacrosse team. Sylvia spent the first course dissecting my appearance. She criticized the frayed edges of my sweater, suggesting with a tight, painted smile that I needed to put more effort into presenting a respectable image for the family brand. She reminded Richard that his business partners frequently attended their weekend country club events, and having a drab, unpolished daughter lingering in the background reflected poorly on his success. I chewed my food in silence, nodding mutely, absorbing every verbal barb without a fight. My lack of pushback emboldened them. They mistook my silence for stupidity. Richard cleared his throat, pouring himself a generous glass of red wine. He looked at me with a practiced, paternal smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Your 18th birthday is coming up fast," he noted casually, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "My accountant drafted some standard paperwork for you to review. Just a routine tax waiver. It shifts some liabilities around to help the family business remain lean heading into the next fiscal quarter. We will sign it over breakfast on your birthday. Simple administrative housekeeping." I kept my gaze fixed firmly on my plate. Administrative housekeeping. He delivered the lie with such polished, effortless ease that anyone else would have blindly trusted him. I mumbled a quiet, "Okay," and asked to be excused so I could finish my history homework. Richard waved a hand dismissively, his attention already shifting back to Chase's athletic achievements. Neither of them noticed the slight tremor in my fingers as I pushed my chair back. They only saw a compliant, easily manipulated target. At 2 a.m, the mansion settled into a deep, hollow silence. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark, staring at a small, blank, plastic keycard resting in the palm of my hand. 2 days prior, while tasked with hanging Richard's dry cleaning, I had slipped his primary home office access card through a cheap digital cloner I purchased online. He assumed a high school senior barely understood basic algebra, let alone radio frequency duplication. I slipped out of my bedroom, navigating the dark hallway in my bare feet. Over the years, I had mapped the geography of this house perfectly. I knew exactly which floorboards groaned and which thick Persian rugs offered silent passage. Richard's home office was a secure fortress of mahogany and leather, situated at the far end of the east wing. I approached the heavy door and pressed the cloned card against the biometric lock pad mounted on the wall. A tiny green light flashed, followed by the soft, satisfying click of the deadbolt retracting. I stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind me until it latched. The room carried the oppressive scent of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket, casting a narrow, controlled beam across his expansive desk. I bypassed the locked filing cabinets and focused on his immediate outbox, the tray where he kept pending documents requiring signatures. Buried beneath a stack of commercial zoning permits, I found a legal document bound in a thick blue cover. The header read, "Irrevocable Relinquishment of Beneficiary Rights." My pulse hammered against my ribs as I scanned the dense legal jargon. Ms. Reed's suspicions were entirely accurate. But the reality printed on these pages was far more devastating than a simple tax write-off. The document outlined a trust fund valued at $5.2 million. The money was seeded by my mother's life insurance policy and her independent real estate investments prior to marrying Richard. The waiver stipulated that upon turning 18, I willfully forfeited all claims to the principal, transferring full executive control to Richard to satisfy outstanding corporate debts. If I signed that paper at the breakfast table, I would be legally destitute by noon. He was actively liquidating my mother's legacy to cover his own failing commercial properties, intending to leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. I pulled my phone out from my pocket, carefully verifying that the camera flash was disabled. I snapped crystal clear photographs of every single page. I needed undeniable proof to show Ms. Reed the next day. I captured the final page, focusing closely on the signature line waiting for my name. Just as I tucked the document back under the zoning permits, a sharp, distinct creak echoed from the hardwood floor in the hallway outside. Someone was walking toward the office. The footsteps were light, rapid, and uneven. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked off the pen light, plunging the room back into total darkness. There was no time to reach the door and slip out unnoticed. I scrambled backward across the carpet, sliding behind the heavy velvet curtains that draped the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pressed my spine flat against the cold glass, pulling the thick fabric tight around my body, just as the electronic lock beeped a second time. The oak door swung open, casting a wedge of yellow hallway light across the Persian rug. It was not Richard. Sylvia slipped into the room, pulling the door shut behind her with urgent haste. She did not turn on the desk lamp. Instead, she paced frantically near the leather sofa, her cell phone pressed tight against her ear. Her voice was a hushed, desperate whisper, stripped of the haughty, calculated arrogance she paraded at the dinner table. "You promised the wire would clear by Tuesday," she hissed into the receiver, her tone dripping with panic. "Richard is getting paranoid about the margins. If he checks the offshore routing numbers before the girl signs the waiver, he will see the discrepancy. You need to move the funds to the Geneva account tonight, or we are both going to prison." I stood frozen behind the velvet drape, my heart racing as a new, terrifying layer of the puzzle revealed itself. Richard was plotting to steal my inheritance to save his crumbling empire, but Sylvia was simultaneously draining Richard's accounts to fund a secret life with a shadow partner. The house was not just built on a foundation of theft, it was a ticking time bomb of mutual destruction, and I was trapped right in the center of the blast radius. The final bell rang, clearing the hallways of the sprawling high school. I waited 20 minutes in a bathroom stall, ensuring the corridors were deserted, before walking toward the mathematics wing. Ms. Reed sat at her desk, grading a stack of exams. She did not look up when I pushed the heavy wooden door open, but she spoke quietly, instructing me to lock it behind me. I approached her desk and placed my phone face up on the polished wood. I swiped through the high-definition photographs I had taken the night before in the dark office. The blue legal cover, the irrevocable relinquishment waiver, the signature line waiting like a steel trap. I also recounted the hushed, desperate phone call I overheard from my stepmother, detailing a secret transfer to a Geneva account. Ms. Reed studied the images. Her expression remained unreadable, but her posture tightened visibly. She stood up, walked to the windows, and pulled the blinds shut, casting the room in long, gray shadows. Turning back to me, she revealed a piece of her past she had kept buried for a decade. Before she was a high school educator, Clara Reed was a senior forensic auditor at one of the most prestigious accounting firms in Boston. She was on the partner track until her firm assigned her to audit Richard's real estate holding group. She found the anomalies. She traced the initial phantom withdrawals. But when she brought the evidence to her managing directors, Richard used his immense leverage to bury the report. He threatened the firm with a crippling defamation lawsuit and pulled all his lucrative accounts. To appease him, the firm fired her. They blacklisted her across the financial sector, forcing her to reinvent her life in a public school classroom. We shared a common enemy. He stole my future, and he destroyed her career. A silent, formidable pact was forged right there between the rows of empty student desks. We needed an airtight cover story for our daily meetings, so I was officially enrolled in remedial math tutoring. For the next 3 weeks, while my peers attended lacrosse practice and debate club, I sat in that locked classroom learning the ruthless, unforgiving art of forensic accounting. Ms. Reed wheeled a double-sided whiteboard to the center of the room. Using black and red dry erase markers, she taught me how to track capital flight. She drew circles representing my mother's original trust. Then she drew arrows pointing to limited liability companies registered in Delaware, which then funneled into offshore entities in the Cayman Islands. Richard was bleeding the trust dry to artificially inflate the value of his failing commercial strip malls in the suburbs. He needed his assets to appear highly liquid to secure new commercial bank loans. By the time the trust was emptied, he would declare corporate bankruptcy on the shell companies, washing his hands of the debt and leaving me holding an empty bag. Sylvia was accelerating the collapse by siphoning cash off the top to fund her own escape plan with a shadow partner. Pictures of a drafted waiver and a whiteboard map were not enough to trigger a federal indictment. Ms. Reed explained that the Federal Bureau of Investigation required concrete proof of intent. We needed the original, signed formation documents for the offshore accounts. Those papers tied Richard directly to the fraud, proving he orchestrated the shell companies himself. I knew exactly where he kept his most sensitive physical assets. His home office housed a massive steel biometric safe bolted directly to the foundation. I told Ms. Reed the safe required a fingerprint scan, but it also possessed a 6-digit numeric override pad for emergencies. Richard was far too paranoid to use a birthday, an anniversary, or a street address. He was a man obsessed with his own cleverness. Ms. Reed stared at the whiteboard, her eyes tracing the numbers we had mapped out. She picked up a marker and wrote down the total starting value of the trust fund, $5,200,000. Then she wrote down the exact percentage Richard drained during his very first illicit withdrawal 10 years ago, a figure she had memorized from her ruined audit, 8%. She did the math on the board. 5,200,000 multiplied by 0.08 equals 416,000. She tapped the marker against the final number, the sharp sound echoing in the quiet room. "A man like your father memorializes his victories," she said, her voice laced with cold certainty. "He celebrates the moment he realized he could steal and get away with it. That first withdrawal was his ultimate triumph over your mother's legacy and my career. The passcode is not a date, it is a trophy. 041600. We had the code, but accessing the office was nearly impossible. Richard worked from home frequently, and the estate was guarded by a sophisticated perimeter alarm system. However, an opportunity loomed on the calendar. In 2 days, Richard and Sylvia were hosting their annual autumn charity gala. The mansion would be swarming with Boston elite, local politicians, and catering staff. To accommodate the massive influx of guests and workers, the interior motion sensors and door alarms had to be deactivated for 6 hours. It was our only window of vulnerability. I would have to slip away from the crowded ballroom, navigate to the restricted east wing, and open the safe while Richard mingled just a few rooms away. If I was caught, Richard would instantly expedite the waiver signature, cut me off without a dime, and likely send me to a disciplinary boarding school until I aged out of the system. The stakes were monumental, but my fear had been entirely replaced by a predatory focus. The narrative shifts to the night of the gala. The estate transformed into a chaotic symphony of string quartets, clinking champagne flutes, and overlapping conversations. I wore a modest, unremarkable black dress, blending into the background as the dull, uninteresting daughter they designed me to be. Sylvia glided through the crowd in a custom gown, radiating false charm, while Richard held court near the grand staircase, boasting to investors about his latest commercial acquisitions. I waited until the caterers began serving the main course, drawing the majority of the guests into the dining pavilion. I slipped through the kitchen corridor, moving silently up the secondary servant stairs. The east wing was dark, quiet, and deserted. The heavy oak door to the office stood closed. I pulled the cloned keycard from my clutch, swiped it over the scanner, and pushed the door open. The room felt suffocatingly still. I bypassed the mahogany desk and knelt in front of the heavy steel safe embedded in the wall. The digital keypad glowed with a faint blue backlight in the dim room. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands remained steady. I raised my right hand. My index finger hovered over the 0 key, ready to input the calculated trophy of my father's greed. I pressed the first digit. A soft electronic beep confirmed the input. I moved to the 4. Before I could press the second number, a shadow fell across the sliver of light spilling from the hallway. The hardwood floor outside the office gave a sharp, unmistakable groan. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were approaching the door, and they were not slowing down. The music from the hired string quartet bled through the thick floorboards, providing a muffled, elegant soundtrack to the grand performance happening downstairs. Over 200 of Boston's wealthiest residents currently crowded our sprawling ballroom. They wore custom-tailored tuxedos and designer silk gowns, sipping vintage champagne while offering endless congratulations to my father on his philanthropic spirit. Richard stood near a towering swan ice sculpture, playing the role of the benevolent host to perfection. He smiled warmly, shook hands firmly, and accepted lavish praise for a new pediatric hospital wing funded entirely by stolen money. I had worn a dull, unremarkable slate-gray dress, playing the role of the invisible daughter until the main course was served. The moment the catering staff wheeled out the roasted tenderloin and distracted the guests, I retreated into the shadows of the servant corridor. Now, I knelt on the cold hardwood floor of his pitch-black office. The electronic keypad of the biometric safe glowed with a faint, ghostly blue aura. My index finger hovered over the first digit. Before I could press the key, the distinct, sharp creak of the hallway floorboards shattered the silence. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and moving steadily closer to the oak door. I pulled my hand back, my breath instantly catching in my throat. I pressed my spine against the side of the massive mahogany desk, willing myself to merge with the dark shadows. The brass doorknob turned, the internal mechanism clicked loudly, but the deadbolt held firm. I had engaged the manual lock from the inside the moment I entered. The person on the other side rattled the handle twice, muttered a quiet, frustrated curse, and slowly walked away. The sound of their expensive leather shoes faded back toward the grand staircase. I exhaled a shaky breath and crawled back to the safe. My window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The catered dinner would last exactly 45 minutes before Richard returned to his study for his traditional post-meal cigar with his investors. I raised my hand and pressed the numbers Ms. Reed had derived from the ruins of my mother's legacy. 0, 4, 1, 6, 0, 0. A low mechanical whir resonated from deep inside the steel door. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a solid, satisfying thud. I grabbed the cold chrome handle and pulled it open. The door swung wide, revealing the dark, guarded core of Richard's empire. I switched on my penlight, keeping the beam narrow and focused. The interior was divided into 2 steel shelves. The top shelf held neat stacks of banded $100 bills, but I ignored the cash. Cash was untraceable. Cash did not secure federal indictments or force a man into a courtroom. My eyes dropped to the bottom shelf. There they were. 3 physical banking tokens rested on a velvet pad. They were small, rectangular digital devices that generated rotating cryptographic codes, essential for authorizing massive offshore wire transfers. Beside the tokens sat a stack of black, leather-bound ledgers. I pulled the top ledger out, set it on the carpet, and flipped it open. The neat columns of printed numbers told a story of systemic, calculated ruin. Richard was not merely a bad businessman struggling to keep his head above water. He was a financial predator executing a controlled demolition of his own holding company. He intentionally defaulted on his domestic construction loans, driving his own commercial properties into foreclosure. Simultaneously, he bled my trust fund dry to maintain his personal liquidity and hide his assets from the banks. The money did not vanish into bad investments. It moved with lethal precision. I traced the routing numbers with my finger. The funds flowed from Delaware shell entities into corporate accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. But the most damning revelation was tucked inside a secondary manila folder labeled with Sylvia's initials. I opened it and found dozens of wire transfer receipts. Richard was funneling millions from his liquidated assets directly into Sylvia's secret European accounts. He thought he was hiding money from his creditors and preparing for a comfortable, bankrupt retirement. He did not realize his wife was preparing to take that stolen wealth and vanish across the Atlantic with a shadow partner. I pulled out my phone and double-checked that the flash was disabled. I hovered the lens over the documents and snapped high-resolution photographs of every page, every token, every routing number. I captured the irrevocable proof of my father's fraud. This was the exact ammunition Ms. Reed and I needed to trigger a federal audit. I reached the final page of Sylvia's wire transfers and tapped the shutter button one last time. The sudden, sharp click of the office door unlocking sent a shockwave of ice straight through my veins. Someone had used a physical master key. The heavy mahogany door swung open. The bright, harsh light from the hallway flooded the dark study, casting a long, distorted shadow across the Persian rug. The beam of light hit me squarely in the chest, illuminating my kneeling figure, the open safe, and the scattered financial ledgers. Standing in the doorway was Chase. He wore a tailored tuxedo, the silk bow tie hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar. He held a crystal glass of amber bourbon in his right hand. My 18-year-old half-brother stared down at me, his eyes tracking slowly from the glowing screen of my phone to the exposed contents of Richard's vault. For a fraction of a second, genuine surprise registered on his face. He had expected to find an empty room, a quiet sanctuary to drink his stolen liquor away from the crowded Gala downstairs. Instead, he found his quiet, apathetic sister committing corporate espionage. The surprise quickly melted into a cruel, triumphant smirk. Chase had spent his entire life modeling Richard's arrogance. He craved power, and right now, looking down at me, he believed he held all the cards. "Well, well," Chase slurred, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. "Look who finally decided to do something interesting with her pathetic life." I did not move. I kept my hand resting firmly on the black ledger, shielding the Cayman routing numbers from his line of sight. "Dad is going to ruin you for this," Chase said, his voice dripping with venomous joy. "He is going to lock you away so fast you will forget what daylight looks like. You are done." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. His thumb hovered over the screen, ready to dial Richard's private number. One call would bring our father storming up the stairs. One call would mean the immediate confiscation of my phone, the destruction of the forensic evidence, and the swift, forced execution of the trust waiver. My heart stopped beating. The air in the room grew incredibly thick, pressing down heavily on my lungs. Panic, raw and suffocating, flared in my chest. If Richard walked through that door, I lost my mother's legacy forever. But as I looked up at Chase, watching the smug satisfaction radiating from his privileged face, the panic suddenly evaporated. Ms. Reed had taught me more than forensic accounting over the past 3 weeks. She taught me how to read leverage. She taught me that every predator has a blind spot, and every golden child harbors a deep, unacknowledged insecurity regarding their place in the hierarchy. A glacial calm washed over my mind, cooling the blood in my veins. The terrified, submissive girl Richard and Sylvia had cultivated was gone, replaced by a strategist. Survival instincts, honed in the dark shadows of this toxic house, clicked firmly into place. Chase thought he had cornered a frightened animal in the dark. He did not realize he had just stepped onto a minefield. I slowly stood up, leaving the ledgers resting on the floor, setting the stage for a vicious counterattack. Chase's thumb hovered over the glowing screen of his smartphone. He was waiting for the performance. He wanted the tears, the desperate pleading, the satisfying spectacle of his older sister crumbling at his designer shoes. For 18 years, Chase had been groomed to view me as a minor inconvenience, a defect in Richard's pristine lineage. Now he believed he held the guillotine rope. I did not drop to my knees. I did not utter a single word of surrender. Instead, I reached into the open steel vault and retrieved a thick manila folder I had set aside moments earlier. I stood up, smoothing the front of my slate gray dress, and tossed the file onto the polished mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "Call him," I said. My voice carried a chilling indifference that made Chase blink. "Dial the number. But before you invite our father up here, I suggest you look at where your mother is sending your inheritance." Chase frowned. The smug satisfaction faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He lowered the phone, his eyes darting between my impassive face and the closed folder. Curiosity is a lethal vulnerability, especially for someone raised on a diet of entitlement and paranoia. He took a cautious step forward, keeping one eye on me, and flipped the cover open. I watched his gaze track across the top page. It was a summary ledger detailing a series of high-yield wire transfers. Chase knew enough about wealth management to recognize the routing codes. The money was bleeding out of Richard's primary domestic holding company and funneling directly into a private banking institution in Zurich. "What is this?" Chase muttered, his bravado cracking. "That is your mother's exit strategy," I replied smoothly. "Sylvia has been siphoning millions off the top of Richard's failing commercial investments. She is sending the capital to a shadow partner in Europe. When Richard's empire officially files for bankruptcy next quarter, she is going to board a first-class flight to Switzerland and leave you standing in the rubble." The color drained from Chase's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen hue. Sylvia had always promised him the world. She paraded him around country clubs, assuring him he would inherit the Boston skyline. Confronted with the documented truth of her betrayal, his foundational reality began to fracture. But I was not finished dismantling his life. I reached over and flipped to the second document in the file. "Keep reading," I instructed. It was a draft of Richard's revised last will and testament dated just 2 weeks ago. Richard was many things, but he was not blind to his wife's extravagant spending habits. He likely suspected Sylvia's infidelity, even if he had not tracked the specific Zurich accounts yet. To protect his remaining hidden assets from a messy, impending divorce and the subsequent asset seizure by federal creditors, Richard had executed a ruthless legal maneuver. The revised document explicitly disinherited Sylvia and, by extension, Chase. Richard was actively liquidating my mother's trust to save himself, and he was simultaneously cutting his golden boy out of the estate to ensure no one else could touch his offshore reserves. Chase stared at the paragraph outlining his disinheritance. His hands began to shake. The crystal bourbon glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the thick Persian rug with a dull thud, spilling amber liquid across the intricate woven fabric. The golden child was dead, killed by the very man who created him. "He is leaving me with nothing," Chase whispered, the realization suffocating him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and panicked. The hierarchy of our toxic household had inverted in the span of 3 minutes. He was no longer the predator, he was collateral damage. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. I weaponized his profound greed and his fractured family loyalty. "Richard is going to federal prison," I stated, my tone offering no room for debate. "The FBI will freeze his domestic accounts, seize the mansion, and auction off your cars. Sylvia will flee to Europe the second the indictments hit the news, and she will not take you with her. You will be tied up in litigation for a decade, fighting for pennies." I paused, letting the bleak, undeniable future settle over him. "Or," I continued softly, "you can make a deal with me." Chase swallowed hard. He was a creature of self-interest, stripped of all leverage. "What kind of deal?" he asked, his voice trembling. Keep your mouth shut, I demanded. Help me secure the physical authentication tokens from this safe. I have a forensic accountant ready to hand this entire network over to the authorities. When the funds are recovered and returned to my mother's original trust, I will ensure you receive a generous, untraceable cut before the federal asset freeze traps you. You walk away wealthy and independent. If you call Richard right now, we both burn. It was a devil's bargain, pitched to a boy who possessed no moral compass, only a desperate instinct for self-preservation. Chase looked at his smartphone, then at the open safe, and finally at the damning ledgers resting on the desk. The internal calculation was swift. His familial devotion was entirely conditional, predicated on wealth and status. With the money gone, his loyalty vanished alongside it. He slid his phone back into his tuxedo pocket. Without uttering a single word of agreement, he reached into the steel vault, picked up the 3 rectangular banking tokens, and handed them to me. We forged a highly volatile, fragile truce in the dark, bound by mutual survival rather than trust. I slipped the tokens and my phone into my clutch, locked the safe, and left Chase standing alone in the dark study with his ruined legacy. I navigated the servant corridors and slipped back into the grand ballroom just as the hired string quartet began their final set. The charity gala raged on, a glittering facade masking a rotting core. Richard smiled for the cameras, oblivious to the fact that his empire had just been fatally compromised. I returned to my bedroom, sliding the physical tokens deep inside a hollowed-out textbook on my shelf. I had the evidence. I had the keys to the offshore accounts. I just needed to survive the next few weeks until Ms. Reed could finalize the dossier for the federal investigators. But predators like Richard possess a chilling intuition when the ground shifts beneath their feet. The uneasy truce I secured with Chase would not buy me the time I desperately needed. The narrative shifts to the very next morning. The lingering smell of stale champagne and catered food hung heavy in the mansion. I walked into the kitchen, expecting the usual tense, quiet breakfast routine. Instead, Richard stood at the marble island, fully dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. His posture was rigid, his jaw set with an alarming, predatory determination. Sylvia sat at the far end of the table, sipping black coffee, her eyes darting nervously toward the doorway. Chase was nowhere to be seen. Richard did not offer a morning greeting. He did not look up from the thick, blue-bound legal folder resting on the countertop. He simply raised his hand and slammed his palm flat against the document. The loud, sharp smack echoed off the high ceilings, shattering the morning silence. "There is a legal loophole," Richard announced, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. His gaze locked onto mine, carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "My attorneys found a precedent in the state tax code. You do not need to reach your 18th birthday to execute a beneficiary transfer if the primary guardian signs a declaration of financial necessity." My heart plummeted into my stomach. The careful timeline Ms. Reed and I had constructed evaporated in an instant. Richard tapped his index finger against the signature line. "We are not waiting 3 months," he stated coldly. "The notary arrives in an hour. You are signing the trust relinquishment this morning." The declaration struck the marble island like a physical blow. Richard stood there, a predator closing his jaws around the final remnant of my mother's life. The calculated timeline Ms. Reed and I had meticulously constructed shattered instantly. We had weeks left on the calendar, a comfortable margin to process the Cayman Island ledgers and authenticate the stolen bank tokens before turning the dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But Richard's paranoia had accelerated the collapse. He smelled the decay in his own empire and decided to execute the kill immediately. He tapped the blue legal cover one last time. "Be downstairs in 1 hour," he demanded, turning his back on me to pour a cup of black coffee. "Dress appropriately. The notary arrives at 9. I did not utter a single sound. I turned on my heel and fled upstairs, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I locked my bedroom door and pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I dialed Ms. Reed's private number. The call connected on the second ring. I spilled the entire disastrous update in a hushed, frantic whisper, pacing the length of my carpeted floor. Richard found a loophole. He moved the deadline. The notary is coming. If I sign that waiver this morning, the $5.2 million vanishes into his offshore shells before noon. I am going to lose everything. Ms. Reed did not react with panic. Her voice came through the receiver, steady, cold, and razor-sharp. "Elara, stop pacing," she instructed. "Take a deep breath and listen to me very carefully. Your father is a narcissist operating on a compressed timeline. He is rushing this transaction because he believes he holds absolute control over the narrative. He thinks he is springing a trap on you." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle over my racing heartbeat. "But an aggressive predator is a blind predator. We are not going to fight his momentum. We are going to use it against him. We are going to let him pull the trigger on his own execution." She explained the counter strategy. It was a perilous, high-wire act of psychological warfare and federal sting operations. We had to feed Richard exactly what he expected to see: a broken, compliant, terrified teenager surrendering her rights. By allowing him to physically execute the illicit transfer while believing the legal paperwork was ironclad, we would elevate his crimes from a messy domestic civil dispute to undeniable multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. He would be handing the FBI the smoking gun on a silver platter. The plan required a flawless performance on my part and a crucial substitution on hers. I hung up the phone, walked to my bathroom mirror, and began preparing for the most important acting role of my life. An hour later, I descended the grand staircase. I wore a plain, oversized gray cardigan, clutching the sleeves tightly in my fists. I hunched my shoulders, keeping my gaze firmly pinned to the floorboards. The living room was bathed in bright, unforgiving morning sunlight. Richard sat in a leather wingback chair, his laptop open on the coffee table. Standing near the fireplace was a woman I had never seen before. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit, holding a leather briefcase. Her demeanor was purely professional, radiating the quiet authority of a corporate notary. Sylvia lingered near the entryway, checking her watch with poorly concealed anxiety. Chase was notably absent, likely nursing his shattered ego and waiting for the dust to settle on our fragile truce. Richard gestured toward the coffee table. "Come here," he ordered, his tone impatient. "This is Ms. Vance, a certified state notary. She is here to witness and authenticate your signature on the relinquishment waiver. Let us get this administrative headache over with so I can get to the office." I walked slowly toward the table, my hands visibly shaking. I looked at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished wood. The final page featured a bold, black line designated for my full legal name: the irrevocable transfer of my mother's legacy. I looked up at Richard, allowing a tear to well in the corner of my eye. "Dad," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly on the single syllable. "Do I really have to sign this? Is there no other way to save the business?" Richard's face hardened. He did not offer comfort. He offered a cold, practiced lecture designed to crush any lingering resistance. "The family business provides the roof over your head and the food on your plate," he stated, his voice tight with irritation. "You have lived a life of extreme privilege, and now it is time for you to contribute. This money is tied up in a redundant trust that benefits no one. By signing this, you ensure the holding company remains solvent. You are securing our future. Now pick up the pen." I looked at the notary. She offered a tight, sympathetic nod, stepping forward to tap a heavy gold fountain pen against the signature line. Ms. Vance watched me closely, her eyes sharp and assessing. What Richard did not know was that the woman standing in his living room was not a state notary hired by his legal team. The original notary had been intercepted an hour ago by a strategically timed flat tire orchestrated by Ms. Reed's contacts. The woman handing me the pen was an undercover investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission, brought in on an emergency mandate based on the Cayman Island ledgers I secured from the safe. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I let out a soft, defeated sob, allowing a single tear to fall onto the thick parchment paper. My hand trembled violently as I pressed the nib to the page. I signed my name, but I did not sign my legal signature. I utilized a subtle, deliberate discrepancy Ms. Reed and I had practiced for weeks. I transposed my middle initial, swapping an E for an A, and deliberately broke the cursive flow on my last name. It was a microscopic deviation, invisible to a man rushing to steal millions, but entirely legally invalidating when scrutinized under a microscope. Furthermore, the presence of an undercover federal agent witnessing a minor sobbing and shaking while signing away her inheritance provided undeniable documented proof of extreme duress. The waiver was legally dead the second the ink dried. But to Richard, it looked like a total victory. I set the pen down and took a step back, wiping my eyes with the back of my sleeve. Richard did not even bother to inspect the signature closely. He snatched the document off the table, handed it to the undercover investigator, and immediately turned his attention to his open laptop. "Thank you, Ms. Vance," Richard said, his eyes glittering with unrestrained triumph as his fingers flew across the keyboard. He was logging into his primary domestic holding account. The administrative hurdle is cleared. I stood silently near the sofa, watching the digital glow of the screen reflect in his eyes. He navigated to the wire transfer portal. He inputted the routing numbers I had photographed the night before. He typed in the exact sum of my mother's trust fund, $5,200,000. He selected the destination account, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, completely beyond the reach of his domestic creditors. He was executing the final stage of his grand theft right in front of me, believing he had outsmarted everyone. He did not realize he had just stepped onto a massive federal landmine. By initiating a multi-million-dollar illicit transfer based on a fraudulent legal document, he crossed the Rubicon. He escalated a messy, localized civil dispute regarding a family trust into a massive, undeniable case of federal wire fraud and international money laundering. He moved his cursor over the bright blue Send button on the banking portal. He did not hesitate. He did not offer a final glance of regret or hesitation. He clicked the mouse. A digital progress bar appeared on the screen, loading the encryption protocols for the international wire transfer. The green bar crept steadily across the monitor. 10%, 40%, 80%. The living room was completely silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Sylvia let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief near the doorway, believing her own secret European escape fund was finally secured. The progress bar hit 100%. A bright green checkmark flashed across Richard's screen. Transaction complete. Funds successfully routed. Richard closed the laptop with a sharp, satisfying snap. He looked at me, a genuine, relaxed smile finally breaking across his face. "See," he said smoothly, "painless. Now go get ready for school." I turned and walked out of the living room, keeping my head bowed. I did not run. I walked at a steady, measured pace until I reached the front door. The undercover investigator followed closely behind me, carrying her leather briefcase containing the legally invalid waiver. As I stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me, the facade of the terrified teenager vanished instantly. I stood on the stone steps, breathing in the crisp morning air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a single, encrypted text message from Ms. Reed. The message contained a screenshot of a secure monitoring dashboard she had set up on her own laptop. The dashboard displayed a silent, flashing red alarm. The wire transfer had been intercepted. The trap had sprung. Richard's empire was officially bleeding out, and the wolves were already gathering at his door. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the glass facade of the downtown Boston skyscraper. Inside the penthouse suite, Richard adjusted his silk tie, admiring the panoramic view of the harbor. His corporate empire appeared untouchable, a monument to his own calculating brilliance. At precisely 8 a.m, the illusion shattered into pieces. A fleet of unmarked black SUVs boxed in the main plaza, blocking the exits. Dozens of agents wearing dark windbreakers stamped with federal acronyms breached the revolving doors. The lobby, usually a quiet cathedral of commerce, erupted into synchronized chaos. Private security guards stepped aside instantly as silver badges flashed in the morning light. The lead investigator handed a thick, undeniably lethal warrant to the front desk manager. Elevators were instantly locked down, commandeered by federal authorities. On the executive floors, the scene resembled a sinking ship, taking on water at a catastrophic rate. Agents marched down the carpeted corridors carrying empty cardboard boxes. They unplugged encrypted servers, seized laptops from docking stations, and ordered high-ranking vice presidents to step away from their keyboards. Men in expensive tailored suits sweated profusely, raising their hands in surrender while being read their rights. Richard stood behind his reinforced glass door, watching his legacy dismantle in real time. He grabbed his desk phone and punched in the direct, secure line to his private wealth manager. The line connected, but the voice on the other end sounded thin, laced with pure terror. Richard demanded an immediate status report on the Cayman accounts. He needed the $5.2 million cleared for withdrawal so he could hire a top-tier defense team and mount a counteroffensive. The wealth manager delivered a fatal blow. A federal mandate had swept across the global banking network just before dawn. The routing numbers attached to the trust relinquishment flagged an international money laundering trigger engineered by the SEC. Every single account bearing Richard's name, both domestic and offshore, was frozen tight. The liquidity he bled from his own holding companies, the cash he stole from my mother's legacy, it was all inaccessible. The digital vaults were locked. He possessed a net worth of zero. The line went dead. Richard hurled the heavy telephone across the room, shattering a framed architectural award on the wall. Miles away at Logan International Airport, a different kind of reckoning unfolded. Sylvia dragged a heavy leather suitcase toward the first-class ticketing counter. The luggage was packed with diamond necklaces, vintage watches, and designer handbags, the portable, untraceable spoils of her marriage. Her secret European partner expected her to arrive in Geneva with liquidated funds to start their new life. She slapped her platinum credit card onto the marble counter, demanding the next available direct flight to Switzerland. The ticketing attendant swiped the heavy metal card. The terminal system beeped, flashing a stark red error code. Declined. Sylvia scoffed, adjusting her designer sunglasses, and blamed a routine fraud alert. She retrieved a secondary black card from her purse. The attendant swiped it again. Another sharp beep. Declined. The ticketing agent looked up, an expression of professional pity masking her face. The screen indicated a mandatory federal hold on all associated assets. Sylvia stood frozen in the bustling terminal. Her glamorous escape route evaporated into thin air. Without the stolen capital, the shadow partner across the Atlantic would never answer her phone calls. She was stranded, stripped of her stolen wealth, and fully exposed to the impending legal fallout closing in on her husband. Back in his besieged office, Richard stared at his trembling hands. His mind raced backward, analyzing the events of the previous 24 hours with frantic clarity. The sudden, convenient appearance of the corporate notary, the flawless execution of the trust waiver, the minor, almost invisible tremor in my hand as I held the gold pen. The pieces snapped together. The submissive, apathetic teenager had orchestrated a multi-agency federal sting operation right under his nose. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and scrolled to my name. I sat comfortably at a desk in Ms. Reed's classroom. The morning bell had not yet rung. The school was quiet, the hallways empty and calm. My phone vibrated against the wooden desk. The caller ID displayed Richard's number. Ms. Reed stood by the window watching the parking lot. She offered a single, affirming nod. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. Richard bypassed any greeting. His voice erupted through the speaker, a torrent of unhinged obscenities and primal rage. He demanded to know what I had done, screaming that he would tear my life apart piece by piece. He threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward, to leave me rotting on the streets without a dime to my name. I let him vent his fury, listening quietly to the desperate gasps of a drowning predator, realizing the water was pulling him under. When he finally paused to draw breath, I leaned forward. The frightened, stuttering girl he terrorized for years was gone. My voice carried a calm, lethal precision that cut through the static of the cellular connection. "I am just doing what you said, Dad," I replied, echoing the exact words he spoke in this very building weeks ago. I am not wasting my time. I ended the call and blocked his number. The disconnection severed the last remaining thread of Richard's sanity. His high-priced defense attorneys pounded on his locked glass door, shouting for him to remain silent and wait for the federal agents to process the search warrant. He ignored their legal counsel entirely. The tactical, calculating businessman vanished, replaced by a desperate, violent animal backed into a corner. He needed to eliminate the source of the leak before the investigators found the physical banking tokens I had secured from his safe. He took the private executive elevator down to the subterranean parking garage, bypassing the agents swarming the main lobby. Standing in the dim concrete shadows of the underground garage, Richard dialed a number absent from his official contact list. It belonged to a man he kept strictly off the corporate books. A brutal, efficient operative utilized for silencing stubborn union leaders and intimidating whistleblowers during hostile real estate acquisitions. The man answered on the first ring. Richard gave him a single, explicit directive. They met beside Richard's dark-tinted sedan. The operative slid into the passenger seat in silence, his dark jacket parting just enough to reveal the heavy steel of a holstered weapon. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white with tension. He ignored the police sirens wailing in the distance, slammed the car into gear, and sped up the concrete ramp into the morning traffic. He set the navigation system for my high school. The white-collar financial war had officially ended. A dangerous physical confrontation was barreling directly toward me. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, fractured shadows across the empty high school parking lot. The final bell had dismissed the student body hours ago. Janitorial staff usually cleared the academic wings by dusk, leaving the sprawling building a hollow shell of echoing linoleum and locked metal doors. I sat alone at a wooden desk in the back of room 214. The overhead fluorescent tubes buzzed with a low, mechanical hum. I waited in the quiet, watching the second hand sweep across the wall clock. I knew he was coming. Cornered predators always return to the source of their pain. Ms. Reed had left the campus 20 minutes earlier to rendezvous with her contacts at the local precinct, leaving me as the bait. Earlier that afternoon, she had taped a military-grade, high-definition audio transmitter to the underside of the chalkboard tray. We needed an undeniable, recorded confession to ensure Richard could never manipulate a jury with his expensive defense attorneys. We needed him to hang himself with his own arrogant words. The heavy double doors at the far end of the corridor slammed open. The noise reverberated like a gunshot down the narrow hall. Two sets of footsteps approached rapidly. One pace was frantic, striking the tiles with erratic panic. The other moved with the heavy, measured tread of a professional enforcer. The frosted glass pane on the classroom door rattled before the brass handle twisted violently downward. Richard stormed inside. The polished, untouchable Boston real estate developer had vanished entirely. His bespoke suit jacket was missing. His silk tie hung loose around a sweat-stained collar, and a dark, dangerous purple hue crept up his neck. Beside him stood a man built like a concrete vault. The off-the-books operative wore a dark windbreaker, his eyes scanning the corners of the room with chilling, professional detachment. The subtle bulge near his waistband indicated a concealed firearm. He closed the door behind them, engaging the deadbolt with a stark, metallic click. We were sealed inside. Richard crossed the floor in 3 massive strides. He did not yell right away. The terrifying part was the deadly, quiet rasp of his breathing. He reached into his trousers, pulled out a folded sheaf of legal paper, and threw it onto the desk in front of me. The pages scattered, revealing a hastily drafted power of attorney document. The header granted Richard irrevocable, total control over my medical and financial decisions. Years ago, when a stubborn municipal zoning official threatened to block a lucrative commercial permit, Richard utilized his dark connections to have the man hospitalized under an involuntary psychiatric hold. He knew exactly how to manipulate the medical system, paying off private physicians to declare inconvenient people legally incompetent. He planned to use that exact same horrifying tactic on his own daughter tonight. "Pick up the pen," Richard ordered, his voice dripping with venom. "You are going to sign this medical proxy right now. Then you will log into the banking portal and unfreeze my holding accounts. If you refuse, this gentleman beside me will drag you to an unmarked van parked out back. I have a doctor on payroll ready to sign a psychiatric commitment order. You will be strapped to a bed in a locked ward, heavily sedated, until your 18th birthday passes in total silence." I needed him to keep talking. I needed his hubris to overflow, filling the room with his own guilt. I pushed my chair back, letting the metal legs scrape loudly against the tile. I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the dusty green chalkboard. I wrapped my arms around my waist, letting my chest heave with fabricated sobs. I looked at him through a curtain of messy hair, portraying the broken, terrified child he expected to conquer. "Why are you doing this?" I whimpered, making my voice crack with feigned despair. "That money belonged to my mother. It was mine." The sight of my apparent surrender fueled his massive ego. The operative by the door relaxed his rigid posture, leaning casually against the door frame, assuming the threat was neutralized. Richard stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of stale coffee and raw fear radiated from his skin. He looked down at me with profound disgust. "Your mother was a fool who did not know how to multiply capital," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "I took her static trust fund and built a skyline. I siphoned those accounts for 10 years, right under the noses of federal auditors. I orchestrated the shell companies in Delaware. I moved the cash to the Cayman Islands using encrypted routing channels. Do you genuinely believe a pathetic, slow-witted teenager can outsmart me in a courtroom? I own the judges in this city. I own the banks. I own you." He delivered the unvarnished confession of his crimes, confirming his direct orchestration of the multi-million-dollar theft. He boasted about the specific offshore routing channels. He admitted to stealing a deceased woman's legacy without a shred of remorse. As his monologue echoed off the cinder block walls, my hands remained hidden behind my back. My fingers traced the edge of the aluminum chalkboard tray, finding the small rectangular piece of plastic. I pressed the central button. A microscopic green light blinked once. Every single word of his arrogant confession was currently streaming live to a secure cloud server monitored by law enforcement. Richard noticed the sudden shift in my eyes. The fabricated tears stopped falling. My posture straightened, discarding the slump of a frightened victim. The terrified routine evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating stare. He realized, a fraction of a second too late, that he had walked blindly into a snare. "You really think you can beat me?" he hissed, the purple flush deepening on his face. He raised his right hand, pulling his arm back to deliver a punishing physical strike to force my submission. Before his palm could swing forward, the world outside exploded. The piercing, oscillating wail of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet evening. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the classroom windows, casting erratic, strobe-like shadows across Richard's horrified face. Heavy boots pounded down the school corridor. The operative near the door reached for his holstered weapon, realizing the trap had closed around them. The classroom door burst open with staggering force, the locking mechanism shattering inward. 3 Boston police officers stormed the room in tactical gear, their service weapons drawn and leveled directly at Richard and his hired muscle. The fixer raised his hands instantly, dropping to his knees on the linoleum to avoid catching a bullet. Richard froze, his raised arm hovering helplessly in the air, his entire empire disintegrating in the blink of an eye. Through the parted sea of dark blue uniforms, Ms. Reed stepped into the doorway. She wore a tailored trench coat, holding a digital tablet in her left hand. She looked at the man who had ruined her accounting career a decade ago. Her expression held no anger, only the chilling satisfaction of a successfully completed audit. "We have every single word on tape, Richard," she stated coldly. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Richard's wrists, binding his hands behind his back. The officers marched him out of the classroom, reading him his Miranda rights, as his pristine reputation shattered into dust. But the true devastation was awaiting him at the downtown precinct, where I prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs resonated sharply in the quiet hallway. Richard, the untouchable titan of Boston real estate, was marched out of the high school building with his hands bound firmly behind his back. The off-the-books fixer had surrendered immediately, dropping his weapon and complying with the tactical officers to avoid a lethal confrontation. Richard did not possess the same survival instinct. He thrashed against the arresting officers, his face contorted in a mask of primal, unhinged fury. He shouted demands to call the mayor, the police commissioner, and a dozen municipal judges he claimed were in his pocket. The officers ignored his arrogant threats entirely. They shoved his head down, forcing him into the back seat of a waiting squad car. The cruiser was parked directly beneath the bright glow of the school entrance lights. A small crowd of late-working faculty members and student-athletes stared in disbelief as the prominent donor and community leader was carted away like a common street criminal. His meticulously crafted public dignity was shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of the very institution he tried to buy. Across the city, beneath the soaring glass ceilings of Logan International Airport, the second pillar of his fraudulent empire collapsed in a remarkably similar fashion. Sylvia stood near the international departure gate, screaming at a pair of stoic Transportation Security Administration agents. The declined platinum cards had been the first warning sign, but she foolishly attempted to bypass the system by producing a secondary, fraudulent European passport. Her secret lover in Geneva had provided the forged documents months ago as a contingency plan. The sophisticated biometric scanners at the checkpoint flagged the counterfeit passport instantly. Federal marshals descended on the terminal before Sylvia could abandon her luggage and blend into the crowd of travelers. The scene was spectacularly humiliating. She wept hysterically, her designer mascara running down her cheeks as the agents confiscated the forged documents, the diamond necklaces, and the vintage watches she had packed in her carry-on bag. The glamorous, untouchable stepmother, who spent years belittling my appearance, was now sobbing on the polished terminal floor, stripped of her stolen wealth and facing multiple federal charges for international flight evasion and possession of counterfeit identity documents. The chaos of the initial arrests eventually settled into the stark, unforgiving reality of the downtown police precinct. Richard sat in a cramped, windowless interrogation room. The walls were painted a dull, institutional gray. The overhead fluorescent tubes buzzed relentlessly, casting harsh shadows across his wrinkled, sweat-stained shirt. Across the metal table sat his primary defense attorney, a sleek, high-priced legal shark who charged $1,000 an hour to make problems disappear. The attorney leaned forward, steepling his fingers, and began spinning a calculated narrative for the two lead detectives in the room. He attempted to frame the entire situation as a convoluted misunderstanding regarding complex family tax liabilities. The attorney claimed Richard was merely executing a sophisticated, albeit aggressive, wealth management strategy to protect his daughter's assets from volatile market fluctuations. He dismissed the recorded confession in the classroom as the frantic, hyperbolic ranting of a stressed father dealing with a rebellious, dramatic teenager. The attorney was smooth, confident, and dangerously close to planting a seed of reasonable doubt in the minds of the local detectives. I pushed the heavy wooden door of the precinct open. The chaotic hum of ringing telephones and shouting officers washed over me. I did not speak to the desk sergeant or ask for directions. I walked straight past the holding cells toward the glass-walled bullpens of the Financial Crimes Division. Ms. Reed followed a few steps behind, her presence a silent, formidable shield against any procedural pushback. I carried a massive 4-inch thick white binder. The sheer weight of the paper strained my wrists, but I held it steady. I approached the primary detective's desk just outside the interrogation room, where Richard was actively plotting his legal defense. I did not say a single word. I simply lifted the binder and dropped it onto the battered metal desk. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the steel echoed loudly, drawing the attention of half a dozen surrounding officers. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bullpen, leaving the detective staring blankly at the cover. The detective reached out and flipped the binder open. His eyes widened instantly. The pages did not contain vague accusations or emotional diary entries. The binder held a devastating, microscopic mapping of multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. It contained the high-resolution photographs of the irrevocable relinquishment waiver, the forged signature clearly marked with a transposed initial. It held the Cayman Island routing numbers, the sequential dates of the shell company formations in Delaware, and the documented proof of Sylvia's illicit wire transfers to Geneva. Most damning of all, the final section contained a certified, time-stamped transcript of Richard's audio confession, cross-referenced with the exact financial figures he boasted about stealing. The high-priced defense attorney's narrative evaporated into thin air. The evidence was irrefutable, meticulously organized, and fully actionable. Richard was booked, processed, and stripped of his tailored trousers and silk tie, forced into a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was escorted to a sterile holding cell to await his federal arraignment the following morning. Despite the overwhelming mountain of forensic data stacked against him, Richard's narcissistic arrogance refused to die. The power dynamics had shifted entirely, but he still believed he held the ultimate trump card. He utilized his single-mandated phone call. He did not dial his defense attorney to strategize bail conditions. He dialed my cell phone number. I sat on a wooden bench in the precinct lobby, waiting for Ms. Reed to finish finalizing her witness statement. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID displayed the main switchboard number for the county holding facility. I accepted the automated charges and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not speak. Richard's voice hissed through the receiver. It was dripping with venomous, smug confidence. He sounded like a man who had just played a brilliant move on a chessboard, oblivious to the fact that the board was already on fire. "You might put me in a cell for a few years, you little brat," he sneered, the static of the prison line doing nothing to mask his hatred. "You got lucky with the microphone. You played a decent hand for a teenager, but you will still be broke when this is all over." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, waiting for me to react with terror or despair. "My offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are protected by triple-layer, military-grade encryption," he boasted, his ego swelling with every syllable. "I paid top-tier security firms to construct those digital vaults. The FBI can freeze the domestic routing channels all they want. The Securities and Exchange Commission can audit the shell companies until the end of the decade, but they can never legally touch the principal hiding in those offshore accounts without the physical authentication codes. The money sits there, completely insulated from federal seizure. You get absolutely nothing. You are going to spend your 20s working a minimum wage job while I sit in a minimum security country club prison, knowing my fortune is waiting for me the day I get out." He delivered his final, devastating threat with practiced malice. He believed he had won the long game. He thought he possessed the ultimate leverage, securing his stolen wealth behind an impenetrable digital wall. I listened to his arrogant monologue. I did not interrupt, nor did I shed a single tear of frustration. A cold, predatory smile formed on my lips. I let him finish basking in his own perceived brilliance. I savored the moment, knowing the trap I had laid for him was far more sophisticated than a simple wiretap. I prepared to deliver a masterstroke that would obliterate his financial existence and leave him screaming silently in his holding cell. The Federal Detention Center sat on the edge of the city limits, a sprawling complex of brutalist concrete and razor wire. The morning air felt sharp and biting as I parked my car in the visitor lot. Walking through the security checkpoints required surrendering my coat, passing through metal detectors, and waiting for heavy steel doors to slide open on electronic tracks. The environment was designed to intimidate, to strip away personal power, and remind every person inside who held authority. It was the exact opposite of the gilded, sprawling mansion I had left behind. I was directed to a sterile visitation room divided down the middle by thick, smudge-covered plexiglass. A row of black telephone receivers hung on the walls. I sat down on a bolted metal stool, folded my hands on the counter, and waited. A heavy door on the opposite side of the room buzzed loudly. A guard escorted Richard into the visitor booth. He wore a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. The fabric hung poorly on his frame, a stark departure from the tailored Italian suits he used to armor himself in. Despite the uniform, the handcuffs, and the bleak reality of his surroundings, Richard still walked with the measured, arrogant stride of a chief executive entering a boardroom. He sat down on his stool, picked up the receiver, and offered a smug, chilling smirk. I picked up my own receiver, pressing the cold plastic to my ear. "I expected you to show up," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension through the crackling phone line. "You came to gloat. Or maybe you came to realize that putting me in a cage does not actually solve your problem. You are still a teenager with no college fund, no home, and no access to the offshore accounts. The federal investigators will spend the next 5 years filing subpoenas in international courts, and the Cayman banks will ignore every single one of them. My wealth is insulated." He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He believed his fortress was impenetrable. He relied on the assumption that complex international banking encryption was a vault no domestic law enforcement agency could crack. I leaned forward, closing the distance between my face and the scratched glass. My posture did not reflect defeat. It mirrored the precise, calculated stance of a predator finalizing a hunt. "You are right, Dad," I whispered into the microphone. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation cannot breach Cayman Island encryption protocols. They cannot force a foreign entity to bypass military-grade digital security. The offshore accounts are a black box." Richard's smirk deepened. He thought I was conceding the match. "But digital encryption only protects against external hacking," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "It does not protect an account when someone walks through the front door using the correct keys." His smug expression faltered, a microscopic twitch betraying a sudden spike of anxiety. He uncrossed his arms. "I did not just photograph the ledgers while you were downstairs hosting your charity gala," I explained, watching his eyes track my every word. "I opened the bottom shelf of your biometric safe. I found the physical authentication tokens. The rectangular devices you use to generate the cryptographic codes for your wire transfers." Richard swallowed hard. The color began to drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. "You could not have taken them," he stammered, his confident facade cracking. "I checked the safe the next morning. The tokens were there. The alarm never triggered." I let out a soft, dry laugh. "They were there the next morning because I put them back," I clarified. "I only needed to borrow them for a few hours, but I did not have to break a sweat to get my hands on them. Your security flaw was not digital. Your security flaw was the toxic culture you bred inside your own house." I paused, letting the silence amplify the impending devastation. "Chase walked into the study while the safe was open," I said. Richard gripped the telephone receiver so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. "Your golden boy caught me," I told him. "He was ready to call you and end my entire operation. But before he dialed your number, I showed him the revised will you drafted, the one where you cut him out of the estate to protect your assets from the impending bankruptcy. I also showed him Sylvia's wire transfers to her secret partner in Geneva. He realized his parents were preparing to abandon him in the ruins of a collapsed empire." Richard pressed his forehead against the glass, his eyes wide with rising terror. "Chase possesses your profound greed," I noted smoothly. "He possesses your instinct for self-preservation. I offered him a generous cut of the recovered funds if he kept his mouth shut and handed me the physical tokens. He did not hesitate. Your own son sold you out to save himself. We secured the keys, generated the necessary access codes, and logged every single credential required to bypass the Cayman security protocols. "No," Richard gasped, his voice breaking into a desperate, hollow wheeze. "You cannot touch that money." The federal mandate froze all the routing channels at dawn. The accounts are locked in legal limbo. The SEC cannot authorize a withdrawal. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression. I did not wait for the Securities and Exchange Commission to freeze the accounts at dawn, I corrected him. I let you initiate the $5 million wire transfer in our living room. I needed you to commit the physical act of wire fraud in front of an undercover federal agent to secure your criminal indictment. But the moment you closed your laptop, Ms. Reed and her associates used the authentication tokens Chase provided. I tapped my finger against the glass, right in front of his face. We logged into the offshore portal a full 12 hours before the federal raid occurred, I said. We did not freeze the capital. We rerouted it. We executed a massive, authorized clawback. We transferred every single dollar out of the Cayman shell companies and wired it directly back into my mother's original ironclad trust account. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man standing on a trap door the second the lever was pulled. Because the capital was verified stolen property returning to its rightful legal beneficiary under a pre-existing trust charter, the transfer bypassed the federal freeze entirely, I explained, delivering the final crushing blow. The transaction was authenticated, clean, and perfectly legal. The money is gone, Richard. It is sitting in a locked account with my name on it, heavily guarded by a team of fiduciary lawyers who will never let you near it. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. His secret offshore safety net was a phantom. His retirement fund was zero. "You have no hidden reserves," I stated, laying out the bleak mathematics of his future. "Your domestic holding companies are drowning in tens of millions of dollars of commercial debt. The IRS is seizing your real estate to cover the tax evasion penalties. You cannot afford your high-priced defense attorneys anymore. You are going to face a federal judge with a public defender, and you are staring down a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence for international money laundering and wire fraud. You are going to die in a cage." Richard dropped the telephone receiver. It dangled by its metal cord, swinging gently against the scratched plexiglass. He pressed both hands against the partition, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He screamed, his jaw unhinging, his eyes bulging with manic despair. Because of the thick soundproofing between the booths, I could not hear a single decibel of his agony. He was a silent, terrifying portrait of total ruin. I stood up from the metal stool, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket. I picked up the receiver to deliver my final parting thought, speaking clearly into the microphone so the sound would transmit to the dangling earpiece swinging near his knees. "You stood in that high school hallway and told Ms. Reed, 'I did not inherit your mind,'" I said, my voice steady, echoing off the cinder block walls. "You told her I was a waste of time." I placed the receiver back onto the wall hook. "You were right," I whispered to the empty room. "I am significantly smarter." I turned my back on the glass. I walked out of the visitation center, navigating the heavy steel doors and the security checkpoints, leaving my father screaming silently in a prison he built with his own 2 hands. I pushed the exit doors open and stepped out into the crisp, bright morning air, breathing in the undeniable scent of freedom. The toxic shadow that haunted my entire childhood had been eradicated. I walked toward my car, knowing the financial war was over, but the era of my independence had just begun. 5 autumns have passed since the federal raid shattered the foundation of my former life. The scales of justice did not merely balance, they tipped with crushing, permanent force, ensuring that the architects of my suffering reaped the exact harvest they sowed. In a brightly lit discount retail store on the outskirts of Worcester, a cashier punches the clock for her evening shift. Sylvia wears a stiff polyester uniform vest over a faded cotton blouse. Her hands, once adorned with heavy diamond rings and manicured weekly at private salons, are now dry and calloused from breaking down cardboard shipping boxes in the dusty stockroom. A frustrated customer tosses a pile of clearance clothing onto the register counter, complaining loudly about a misprinted price tag and demanding to speak to a manager. Sylvia forces a tight, strained smile, apologizing profusely while scanning the barcodes with a trembling hand. She swallows her pride, repeating the corporate customer service script she was forced to memorize. Her grand European getaway evaporated the day the federal marshals confiscated her forged passports at Logan Airport. Without access to the stolen capital, her secret partner across the Atlantic stopped returning her phone calls, vanishing into the ether like smoke. She currently lives in a cramped ground-floor apartment, surviving paycheck to paycheck. She rides the public bus in the freezing rain, haunted every single day by the phantom weight of the luxury she traded her soul to maintain. 30 miles away, the golden child of the family stares at a glowing smartphone screen displaying a severe negative banking balance. Chase walked away from the wreckage of his father's empire with the exact financial settlement I promised him in the dark study. It was a substantial, clean sum of recovered capital, more than enough to fund a university education and secure a modest, comfortable start to his adult life. But Chase possessed the reckless, arrogant DNA of a man who believed he was destined to conquer the financial world without putting in the actual labor. He bypassed higher education entirely, funneling his settlement into highly volatile cryptocurrency margins and speculative day trading. He attempted to replicate his father's predatory success without understanding the complex mechanics of the market. Within 3 short years, he hemorrhaged every single dollar. His brand new luxury sports car was repossessed by the bank. He currently rents a drafty studio apartment situated above a noisy, round-the-clock laundromat. He is estranged from his mother and entirely exiled from the wealthy social circles that once worshipped him. He sends me an email every 6 months begging for a personal loan. I automatically route his messages directly to the trash folder without reading past the subject line. The primary architect of this generational ruin resides behind 3 layers of electrified fencing at a federal penitentiary. Richard occupies a tiny concrete cell containing a metal toilet and a thin, uncomfortable foam mattress. The Boston elite erased his name from their contact lists the morning his indictment hit the front page of the Financial Times. The hospital board quietly removed his philanthropic plaque from their pediatric wing, replacing it with a generic dedication to anonymous donors. He is a ghost in the corporate world. His tailored Italian suits were traded for coarse, faded prison garments that hang loosely on his diminishing frame. The sharp, commanding presence that once terrorized boardrooms and dictated domestic policy has withered into the brittle, stooped posture of an old, broken man. He spends his mandated recreation hour pacing the edge of the chain-link fence, mumbling to himself about encrypted offshore routing channels that no longer exist. He has 15 years left on his mandatory minimum sentence. No one visits him on the weekends. No one accepts his collect calls. He is drowning in the suffocating silence of his own irrelevance. The scene transitions sharply from the bleak gray walls of a federal prison to the gleaming, sunlit expanse of a downtown Boston high-rise. I stand near a floor-to-ceiling glass window on the 40th floor, looking out over the sprawling harbor. The skyline stretches endlessly, a testament to legitimate commerce and genuine ambition. I am 23 years old. I wear a tailored charcoal gray blazer, resting my hands on the edge of a massive, polished mahogany boardroom table. This is the headquarters of Vanguard Asset Reclamation, the city's premier boutique forensic accounting firm. I did not merely survive the trauma of my adolescence. I weaponized the survival tactics I learned in the dark corners of my father's study, transforming them into a highly lucrative, legally devastating business model. My firm specializes in dismantling complex financial fraud. We hunt down hidden capital, untangle offshore shell corporations, and recover stolen wealth for defrauded partners, marginalized shareholders, and vulnerable spouses. The legal community refers to my agency as the apex predators of the financial sector. We do not lose cases because I know exactly how arrogant men attempt to bury their sins, and I know exactly where to look for the shovel. I employ a dozen brilliant investigators who share my relentless drive for accountability. The frosted glass door of the boardroom swings open on silent, oiled hinges. My senior partner steps into the room carrying 2 steaming cups of dark espresso and a thick blue-bound case file. Clara Reed left the public school education system 4 years ago to help me build this empire. She traded her modest teacher cardigans for sharp, bespoke designer suits. She places the coffee on the mahogany table and slides the heavy dossier across the polished wood toward me. "We have a new client," Clara says, taking a seat and crossing her legs. "A high-profile technology executive in Cambridge is filing for a highly contested divorce. His wife suspects he is severely undervaluing his startup shares and siphoning marital assets into a decentralized ledger." I pick up the dossier, opening the cover to review the preliminary tax filings. The numbers on the page form a familiar, distinct pattern of deception. The capital flight is sloppy, hidden behind a facade of convoluted corporate jargon meant to intimidate opposing counsel. It is the exact same strategy my father utilized to obscure his own theft. "The opposing legal team sent a settlement offer this morning," Clara continues, a dry, knowing chuckle escaping her lips. "The executive offered his wife a fraction of a percent. He told his attorneys she is just a stay-at-home mother. He actually put it in writing that she is far too uneducated to understand the complexity of his offshore asset distribution. He thinks his wife is too stupid to find the money." I trace my index finger down the column of fraudulent expenses. The hubris radiates off the printed page, echoing the exact same toxic arrogance that once plagued my own life. A familiar glacial calm washes over my mind, sharpening my focus into a lethal point. The prey has walked willingly into the crosshairs, blinded by his own towering ego and his fatal underestimation of the woman he swore to protect. I close the blue folder, letting it hit the desk with a definitive, satisfying smack. I look up at my senior partner. A chilling, shark-like smile spreads across my face. "Let him think that," I reply, my voice steady and cold. It makes breaking them so much easier. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling glass of my corner office, watching the Boston Harbor fade into the twilight. The city lights flicker to life, illuminating a grid of steel and concrete where thousands of contracts are signed every single evening. 5 years ago, I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a sprawling suburban mansion, waiting for my own father to erase my future. Today, I dictate the terms in the very skyline he tried to conquer. My transition from a silent, dismissed teenager to the chief executive of Vanguard Asset Reclamation was not born out of inherent genius or luck. It was forged in the cold, unforgiving crucible of necessity. When broken clients sit across my mahogany desk, weeping over hidden accounts and shattered vows, they often ask how I survived the orchestrated wreckage of my own family. I tell them the truth. I stopped playing the victim and started reading the ledgers. Looking back at the smoldering ruins of Richard's corporate empire, I carry 5 distinct lessons that guide every single move I make in this industry. First, underestimation is your most lethal tactical advantage. When an abuser convinces himself you are slow-witted and compliant, he stops covering his tracks. He leaves the biometric safe unlocked. He leaves the offshore routing numbers resting on the mahogany desk. By embracing the role of the fool, you allow the enemy to hand you the very blueprint required to dismantle his life. Second, silence is a strategy, never a surrender. You do not need to raise your voice, argue at the dinner table, or demand respect from people who view you as an administrative hurdle. You simply need to nod, smile, and meticulously collect the financial receipts in the shadows. Third, loyalty purchased with stolen wealth carries a rapid expiration date. I watched a pampered golden child sell out his own father to save his bank account, and a glamorous stepmother abandon her husband the second her credit cards declined at the airport terminal. Toxic domestic hierarchies dissolve instantly the moment the illicit funding dries up. Fourth, true personal independence is firmly rooted in financial literacy. Understanding how capital flows, how shell corporations operate, and how to read a complicated tax return provides an impenetrable shield against manipulation. Mastery of the numbers strips the predator of their leverage. Fifth, karma is not a passive, mystical force. The universe does not magically punish corrupt individuals simply because they deserve ruin. Justice requires a deliberate catalyst. Someone has to crack the vault code, photograph the wire transfers, and hand the undeniable dossier over to the federal authorities. My father thought he was invincible because he possessed status and influence. He forgot that every fortress harbors a structural flaw, and he handed me the hammer to strike it. I built my own sanctuary from the rubble he left behind. Thank you for listening to my journey here on Maya Tells Stories. If this narrative of survival, forensic accounting, and ultimate retribution resonated with your own experiences, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to our community. On Maya Tells Stories, we explore the hidden corners of human deception and the calculated steps required to reclaim your personal power. Drop a comment below sharing which of the 5 lessons hit the hardest for you, and let me know how you would have handled the trust relinquishment waiver. Stay vigilant, always trust the numbers, and I will see you in the next video.